Today, we're going to begin to look at the minor prophets. We're going to look at the first four of the minor prophets. The minor prophets are, of course, 12 different individuals in which these books are written by and about. So, we're going to look at them individually over the next couple weeks. Um, so, first of all, why are they called the minor prophets? Who are they and why are they minor? Well, first of all, here's the minor prophets. You have Hosea, Joel, Amos, Obadiah, Jonah, Micah, Nahum, Habakkuk, Zephaniah, Haggai, Zechariah, and Malachi. All very Hebrew names. And you have these individuals. Again, the books are written about them, by them, and there'll be some discussion, particularly on the about and by, when we look at the book of Jonah, which would be not this week, but the next time we pick up the lectures for the minor prophets. Um, but we use the terminology minor because the books tend to be smaller in comparison to the major prophets, which wrote a great deal more. So, this is the only reason we're saying they're minor. They are contemporaries to some of the major prophets, and we'll look at that in this next slide. You have, it is thought that Obadiah, Jonah, Joel, the earliest of these, so we're looking at 8th century. Then moving into the 7th century, you have Amos, Hosea, Micah, and Isaiah being a contemporary in that time period. Then Nahum, Zephaniah, with Jeremiah, the major prophet, being a contemporary in that time period. Then Habakkuk being a contemporary with Daniel, Ezekiel, and then the book of Lamentations. Of course, this is thought to be written later. And so that is the book written by Jeremiah. And then toward the end of the Old Testament and the Old Testament period before the intertestamental period, which is the period between the two testaments, you have Haggai, Zechariah, and Malachi. Now, these are post-exilic prophets. Haggai, when you read the book of Haggai, you'll see he's calling people back to the fact that they came from captivity, they were post-exile, they came back, they built the walls, they built their houses, but they had not yet built the temple. And Haggai is calling them to get back into the right perspective and the fact that they need to build the temple of God. Okay. So these are after the exile has taken place. And what I mean by that is the Babylonian captivity, where Babylon conquers, they destroy the temple, 586. Then they call people later on back in the late 500s. They go back with orders from King Darius, and we'll get into some of that historical elements as we go along. But again, they're not so minor. The minor prophets are only minor in the length of material which they wrote. But the impact of the prophecy of the minor prophets was just as relevant as the major prophets. And then the first one we're going to look at this week is Hosea. And we'll call it a different kind of love story. Because there is a love story played here, but it's not the classic ones that you would think of. Okay, you've got Hosea married to a woman named Gomer, and there's a lot of things that go along with that love story. It's not like a Old Testament narrative like a Ruth and Boaz. It's not that kind of love story. It's a different kind of love story. And so, looking at the content of Hosea, the structure up up at the first part, you're looking at Hosea's marriage and his children, and it's thought that there's a play going on here, and the play on this is the names of the children, with Lo Ruhama and Lo Ami, and the names of the children reflect that it is the possibility that these children do not actually belong to the marriage of Hosea and Gomer. Gomer has been unfaithful. So a picture is being painted with the relationship between Hosea and Gomer as to the relationship between God and Israel. Uh, Probably the best passage in the book of Hosea is actually the chapter 3 passage. So the actual entire chapter 3 passage, which I will look up for you and I will read to you. And it goes like this. Then the Lord said to me, "Go again, love a woman who is loved by a lover and is committing adultery, just like the love of the Lord for the children of Israel, who look to other gods and love raisin cakes of the pagans. So I bought her for myself for 15 shekels of silver and a homer and a half of barley. And I said to her, you shall stay with me many days. You shall not play the harlot, nor shall you have a man. So too will I be toward you. For the children of Israel shall abide many days without king or prince, without sacrifice or sacred pillar, without ephod or timphah. Afterward, the children of Israel shall return and seek the Lord their God and David their king. They shall fear the Lord and his goodness in the latter days. So, the illustration that is going on here with the marriage between Gomer and Hosea, going back to chapter 1, the Lord called him to go take a wife of harlotry and children of harlotry, for the land has committed great harlotry, departing from the Lord. There's some discussion amongst scholars as to what God is calling Hosea to do. Is he calling Hosea to take a woman who is a prostitute and make her his wife? Or is he calling him to marry a woman that will ultimately be unfaithful to him? There's all kinds of discussions that you can get into that we will not get into in depth in this course because it is a survey course, but there's a lot of material out there, and it really speaks of love and forgiveness and faithfulness. So, uh, if you're really wanting to understand that better, there's some material that you can grab a hold of and read on that structure and that topic. Uh, but you see the first prophetic cycle because Hosea is one of the longer books in the Minor Prophets, 14 chapters. You see this first prophetic cycle with the judgment oracles and the salvation oracles. Usually that's how it happens. You have judgment up front, salvation at the end, a lot of judgment. And then ultimately salvation comes in the end. You have the second prophetic cycle with judgment oracles and a salvation oracle, and then a wisdom colophon. So that's content, another areas of content that you need to be aware of, that Hosea has a number of associations between Mosaic law and its blessings and cursings and the activity of northern Israel. Hosea's marriage to a prostitute and the naming of his offspring are indicative of Yahweh's marriage and divorce from his wife Israel. So that's the huge thing that comes into play when you're dealing with the book of Hosea. Authorship. It is thought that Hosea wrote this, as painful as it might be, for him to recount the things that went on in his personal life. It is thought that he wrote this. So Hosea is the only northern prophet who served Israel sometime between 750 BC and 715 BC, making him one of the earliest of the prophets. As Hosea was from the north during the period of Micah, Amos, Micah, and Isaiah were in the south, were from Judah. So you have the northern kingdom of Israel, southern kingdom of Judah. He's in the northern kingdom. And then there are those who were prophesying in the southern kingdom. So he's a contemporary of Amos, Micah, and Isaiah. The genre, uh, Hosea 1 through 3 is a type of introduction. It is setting the stage. It is a prose oracle. And then while you have 4 through 14 are poetic oracles. There's a high degree of imagery and symbolism that constitutes between the relationship between Yahweh and his wife Israel. And that is coming through the marriage, the connection of Hosea and Gomer, illustrating that images and symbolism. Okay, the second one we're going to look at this week is Joel. Joel, a prophet of the land. And so, what are some of the contents and the themes from Joel? The day of the Lord is a prominent theme in the book. Um, it is thought, particularly since Peter on the day of Pentecost looks back to Joel when the sons and daughters would prophesy, that Peter is making the connection between the prophecy that Joel brought forth from God in his time, that he was making the prophecy connection back to Joel. Peter was making the prophecy connection back to Joel, saying, this is what Joel spoke of the day of Pentecost, when Peter gives that great sermon in the book of Acts. And this ominous day signifies judgment on some and salvation on others. God's Spirit will be poured out with a universalized and democratic effect on all people. Sons and daughters would prophesy, remember. And then a locust plague serves as a visceral, tangible judgment of the day of the Lord. That's why there's also some debate as to the fact that that day has not happened yet. So while I kind of take I take the road that it did happen, because anytime the New Testament writers directly make a correlation to events from the Old Testament, I see the significance, and I say, well, that must be what was meant. But there are some debate among scholars. You haven't figured that out. That's what scholars like to do. They like to sit around and debate these things. Authorship and date. Little is known about Joel, other than he's the son of Pethuel. the absence of Assyrian and Babylonian, northern Israel, and a Judean king suggests 5th century BC, so a later date for the book of Joel. Scholars suggest dates from the 9th to the 2nd centuries. So they throw it anywhere, and that's a huge period of time. He could either be the earliest one or the latest one. Um, and then a lack of historical reference may provide a trans-temporal application of the day of the Lord and the judgment and salvation of Judah and the nations. Almost to say, um, the lack of these historical events connected to this prophecy doesn't give it a clear time period. As far as the book's the book's layout, you have the locust plague, immediate disaster. You have the day of the Lord, impending disaster. You have the response of Yahweh, and to the immediate disaster of locusts. Then you have the impending disaster of the day of the Lord. And the book is mostly functioned as a corporate lament within temple liturgy, meaning that the book was used as lament in the liturgy of the temple during the function of worship. Um, so we'll look at Amos next, the non-prophet prophet. He was not the son of the prophet. He was basically a man of the land. He was a farmer. Um, he doesn't come from a lineage of anywhere. He just kind of comes from a place, but comes from relatively nowhere. He wasn't connected to some kind of um, temple lineage like other prophets were. The content, the book of Amos contains 3 parts: oracles against the nations. Yahweh will surely punish the idolatry and met out social justice. You have the judgment speeches against Israel. In chapter 3 reflects on a prophetic lawsuit. You have the defendant, meaning Israel, the plaintiff, God, and then you have the history of relationship between the two parties, cross-examination through rhetorical questions. And then you have the authority of the prophet, lawyer, and then the uh, witnesses the nations for basically the rest of the book. Usually, when you look at the book of Amos, all the action takes place up front. There are some prophecies in the back end, but a lot of the uh, action takes place up front. So when you hear Amos, he's giving out these oracles against the nations, and he's going around beginning in verse 3 of chapter 1. It says, "Thus saith the Lord, for 3 transgressions of Damascus, or for 4, I will not turn away its punishment, because they have threshed Gilead with implements of iron." So he's going around all these different nations. He's telling them, this is what God is saying: for 3 transgressions, or for 4, of Damascus, Gaza, Tyre, Edom, Ammon, Moab, Judah. So he was going around to all the other nations and listing out the judgments against them, why judgment is coming to them for the sin that they have committed. And he is a prophet to the northern kingdom, So what he's doing is he's playing up to Israel, talking about all the nations around them. And when he gets to chapter 2, verse 6, he says, "Thus says the Lord, for 3 transgressions of Israel and for 4." Basically, you can imagine that he's there in Israel this, giving out these judgments against all the other nations. And they're jumping up and down because, this is all their enemies that God's going to judge. But then Amos turns around and he gets to the fact that Israel will be judged. And he lists all the sins that they have committed. And you read those, um, they're just as bad, if not worse, all that Israel is doing. And so this is why God's going to judge Israel for what they do. They're not plumb, they're not square, they're not on the right track. They need to get back in line with God. If not, something bad's going to happen. You have reports of prophetic visions in chapter 7 through 9. You have the locust plague, drought, the plumb line, which is a device used to determine the viability of a city wall, and then the ripe basket of fruit. They're overripe. They're ready to be thrown out. So, author and date. Amos is from the Judean town known as Tekoa, 5 miles from Bethlehem. Bethlehem because that is the place of David, also the place of the Messiah. New Testament, this is where Jesus is born. Despite the fact that his ministry was to the northern kingdom. And so he was calling the northern kingdom, Israel, in line and giving the prophecy to them. A little bit more about Amos. Uh, Amos identifies himself as a shepherd and a vine dresser, which raised doubt as to his historical status or his social status in Judah. Again, you know, he doesn't come from some priestly line. Amos uses the term shepherd as opposed to the normal term, 2 different terms, which is used to describe the one who manages the flock. And a congate, uh, conate from Utric. You have one suggesting that he may have been a large scale breeder. You also have the suggestion that he may have been a mid level manager of flocks. Both of these explanations require a sizable leap to cultural time and distance and do not explain his occupation as a tender of sycamore trees. Um, but really, it's the fact that Amos is not really known as a prophet. He's something else. It's like God just called him out of what he was doing and said, "Get over here and do this because I have this mission for you." He served during a most prosperous time. Um Jeroboam the second was on the throne. That's why when you go through, I think Amos was probably a funny guy. He has a line when he is speaking to Israel, when he says, "You cows of Bashan." Basically, he's speaking of the high and mighty women of the area of Bashan in Israel. Uh, Basically, he calls them heifers. So he uses wordplay. Um, he's a man of, he's kind of just almost, you would think he was just kind of brute. to the point. And God uses all kinds of people and people with temperaments like that to do things for Him. Um, I think it's kind of funny reading through Amos sometimes. Uh, but he dates his ministry 2 years prior to the earthquake which occurred during Jeroboam II's reign. Again, Israel was prosperous. He was not an official or professional prophet. He took his mantle to Bethel and uh, Amaziah the priest. So there you go. As far as genre and how it's laid out, the genre is prophetic. You have oracles against the nations. You have judgment speeches, woe oracles, prophet lawsuit. Um, for the literary genre of prophecy and prophet lawsuit, this is probably the number one place you go to. Funeral dirge, vision oracles, and then a salvation oracle at the ending. Obadiah, the next book we're going to look at, it'll be the last book we're going to look at this week. Obadiah was a brief prophet. It's a very short book, and it goes by pretty quick. Edom will experience complete destruction, whereas Israel will be destroyed. And then you have Yahweh is the divine warrior who fights on behalf of his covenant people. Authorship of Obadiah. Obadiah is a possible contemporary to Jeremiah and a witness to the fall of Jerusalem at the hands of the Babylonians in 586 BC. The 9th century BC has also been suggested because of the context of 2 Kings 8. Then you have the text indicates that Edom was complicit in the ransacking of Jerusalem, especially in the destruction of the temple. As far as genre is concerned, we have Obadiah 1 through 14. And 15 through 21, a similar style to Jeremiah 48, 7 through 16. Then you have the continues of the Lord's Day and the oracles against the nations from the previous books in the 12. Primarily, you have the Lord's Day coming from Joel, oracles coming from multiple books, including Amos. So you have the same genre working in there. This is why this is the prophetic books, but unique in that it is an entire book focused on an oracle against one nation, and that's Edom. And it continues the theme of the Abrahamic covenant. Those who will bless you, I will bless, and those who curse you, I will curse. This is that Abrahamic covenant that we see way back, the promise of God to Abraham. And so this is where we're going to end this lecture this week. We'll pick up with the next book, which is Jonah, in the next lecture. I hope you have a wonderful day, and we'll see you later.